a little bit more into the presidency as an institution. Again, we'll have a bit more to say about this likely on Friday as we transition to talking about the courts and preparing ourselves for our Unit 4 lecture or Unit 4 discussion a week from today. When we think about the presidency, it's important to note that we think about the role of power, when we think about the mechanics of the office itself, there are some really key theoretic models that can help us understand, by and large, the role of the presidency and the behavior of presidents from an institution standpoint. When we tend to think about the executive branch and its relationship to, say, legislation, for example, and the legislative process, again, that's a byproduct of FDR's administration to the present, this sort of broader engagement of a policy agenda from an administration being reflected in the will and jockeying of legislation itself in Congress. How a president leads and engages with people towards their point of view or their preferences about governance and policy. One of the key kind of dynamic debates about this comes from two political scientists. Richard Neustadt offers a classic theory that actually takes us back to the mid-20th century, what's called power with persuasion. And the notion of the presidency as a key place by which it is the president's job to persuade the public, to persuade policymakers that what the president wants is what the people want, and what the people want is what the president wants. And that is how one attains those policy goals and maintains that level of power and engagement through a presidential administration. And that sounds good. And I'll ask you, what do you think about that? Students usually overwhelmingly say, regardless of the reality of the presidency, they like that. They like the idea of the power of persuasion and the engagement of a president in the policymaking process. But the theory of power without persuasion by Howell is a really key counterpoint to that. And it's the notion that for all we invest and think about and want to envision the role of the presidency as a place of persuasion of the people, really the modern presidency has been a place of growing power and to engage and use that power without persuasion. And this is by the road of executive directives, and especially the role of executive orders. So executive orders, these are, in terms of the legality, in terms of the power, in terms of the kinds of area of purview, they are more limited in that they have to do with something that's under the power of the executive branch itself. So something that's federal, meaning something that has to do with the national government, and something that has broader connection or oversight of the president in particular. So, some area of the federal bureaucracy, for example, some area of the military, for example, or, like I said, particular agencies. So it has to do with something over which the executive branch has power. So it can't just be something random in a state or specific issue, but it has to do with federal power, federal government, something the executive branch has power over. In terms of legality, are executive orders legal? Yes, they are super legal. It's not really a designation, but they absolutely are legal. They are fundamentally, by and large, binding. The only way they can be changed or altered is if Congress pushes back with law or policy legislation that will challenge an executive order, or if the executive order is deemed unconstitutional by the federal courts. So executive orders are a way, increasingly in the modern era, by which presidents have enacted policy agenda. But they are binding and legal, and unless other branches of the institutions of government seek to take action, they have staying power. And when do they go into effect? Immediately. So they are, in fact, a pretty key, powerful, and at times tantalizing tool by which the executive branch can wield power. And they have grown over time. They've grown over time, particularly as we see a reflection in the churn and transformation of the Congress and the electorate itself, as we're a nation that's greater partisan identifying, fewer incentives to compromise, right? We know the role of compromise, cooperation, or obstruction as the tools of policy making. As increasingly the latter has been used, the role of actually being able to govern through legislation is harder than ever. I was listening to a great seminar this week from Adam Abramowitz. He was the one whose ideas of negative partisanship we talked about. And he did a wonderful seminar through the University of Virginia's Center for Politics on Thursday that I happened to be able to snag a seat in, a virtual seat. And he articulated very well that we are at peak polarization, right, in terms of elections, et cetera. So the role of policymaking to attain outcomes is more difficult than ever in a real politic kind of way. So the effect of being able to make some policy advancement on behalf of your party preferences, on behalf of your particular administration, this is part of the reason why executive orders have grown over time. But there are certainly some significant weaknesses to executive orders. They can be undone from administration to administration. And that is certainly something that we've seen over the last several presidential administrations. One of the growing aspects of polarization in the first and second terms of Barack Obama, we saw more use of executive orders, particularly after 2014, when the House and Senate became Republican and there was no legislation whatsoever that was coming through in engagement. Greater use of executive orders took place. Donald Trump used them extensively to undo as much Barack Obama's administration policy outcomes as possible by executive order, and issued an enormous number of them over time. Joe Biden so far has issued a modest amount by comparison to previous presidencies, but is likely on track to maintain a statistical average of those over time. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a share of the modern presidency's executive orders. So over 8 years in the presidency, George W. Bush issued 291 executive orders. Barack Obama, over 8 years in the presidency, issued 276 executive orders. Trump, over 4 years in the presidency, issued 220 executive orders. Joe Biden so far has issued 38 executive orders. By comparison, the largest in history was FDR, who served, as we know, an unprecedented 4 terms, the Great Depression and World War II, had a record of 3,728 executive orders. All told, we've accumulated, I think, a little more than 11,000 executive orders from George Washington to the present. So that role of growth of executive orders and their implications are certainly part of that process as well. Okay. So the last thing that I wanted to articulate, I think we'll save conditional pandering theory and the life cycle of the presidency for Friday. That's totally cool. But the last thing that I want to say as we finish up, that the role of the presidency does present this unique circumstance. It is the only branch of government that has term limits. Again, before FDR, before the 23rd Amendment, that role of 2 terms in the presidency, for me, was marked by the gravitas of George Washington, making the point that the presidency was not a lifetime institution. It was not a place for an ambitious person to just rule by fiat forever. But it is the only branch of government that is limited to 2 terms, to 8 years. That means to 4 or 8 years. That means that the life cycle of the presidency, the kind of era of pressure and the kinds of dynamics are much more geared towards permanent crisis than other branches of government. The construct of issue salience, of policy making and initiation, this is definitely more of a crisis environment than the other branches of government. So for the presidency, you've got 4 to 8 years, and the ability to make legislation, to persuade or not via the role of power without persuasion, still has limited time. So the mechanics by which a president will approach policy areas, the urgency by which they do so, this definitely is accelerated in the executive branch in ways that it isn't with Congress, and certainly not with the courts itself. So this construct of going public, of engaging the people, engaging citizens through public events, through press conferences, through speeches, through visiting places in the country and connecting with citizens. These are all mechanisms by which the presidency helps to engage the role of the people, because there is a sense of limited time, and being able to raise issue salience and that direct connection between president and constituent is one key mechanism by which presidents often will help to shape and raise their policy preferences for other branches like Congress to take action. So the kinds of decisions they make, whether or not that's shaped in the process of being an incumbent seeking re-election, that really does have some consequences. So that's where we'll talk about the life cycle of the presidency and conditional pandering theory on Friday. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that we can finish up and wrap up for today. I know I've been talking a lot. There's a lot to say about this topic for sure, but I really do hope that you feel comfortable with it. If not, I really do hope that you stop by 12:30 or stop by office hours 2:30 to 4:30, or send me an email, because I'd very much like to be in conversation with you. Again, as a reminder, Wednesday, the 14th, we have our paper assignment workshop. At this point, you should have your topics selected. You should be engaging with your materials and starting to get ideas on the page. If you haven't, please get started on looking up, selecting, and getting underway with those topics. We're going to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb on Wednesday. In both of the class sessions will be live to make sure everybody has access to connecting with that. So before I let you go, one last opportunity to touch base. Does anybody have any questions about the lecture, about what's going on? I really do want to make sure you're feeling comfortable. Okay. Well, if you are, yeah, go ahead, Court. You're unmuted.
Oh, no, I was just saying, I think we're good.
Okay, you know what? I appreciate that. I needed to hear that confirmation. You and the pizza are really cute, so that's awesome. I didn't get a chance to eat breakfast this morning, so I'm inspired now. I'm a little hungry, so it's all good. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for participating and joining us, and I look forward to being in touch soon. Thank you so much. You all have a good one.